In Coldwater Correctional Facility, a black inmate was about to challenge a brutal disciplinary system disguised as order. What started as a denied request for library access spiraled when Sergeant Ray Kincaid engineered a violent medical evaluation for another inmate, sending a message through blood. Malik Ramsey wasn't your typical wrongfully convicted inmate. For over a decade, he had endured the systemic erasure of his life, his profession, and his dignity, known for his sharp mind, quiet resilience, and a past life as an ethics professor who once taught about the very institutions that now sought to crush him. When Kincaid stripped Ramsey of privileges, orchestrated psychological warfare, and finally unleashed physical punishment masked as discipline, he had no idea he was messing with a man who saw power not just as brute force, but as a machine of recordable patterns and fallible systems. Ramsey didn't fight back with fists. He built a case, one recorded confession, one cracked conscience, one coerced ally at a time, setting off a covert uprising that would turn Coldwater's own policies into the noose around its leadership's neck. What began as an abuse of power buried behind institutional silence would become a reckoning written in ledgers, leaked recordings, and the testimonies of broken men made whole again through resistance. The entire prison industrial complex would never forget the day Sergeant Kincaid realized his own system had documented his downfall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cuffs bit into Malik Ramsey's wrists as the transport van rumbled through the final checkpoint. He'd been silent for the entire 4-hour drive from the county jail, absorbing every detail. 3 guard rotations, 14 checkpoints, and the precise 7-minute window when the radio went quiet at shift change. Old habits from a life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing mile. A heavy-set guard with tobacco-stained fingers rapped on the metal partition. "Welcome to Coldwater, Professor." End of the line. Ramsey didn't flinch at the mockery in the man's voice. His eyes remained fixed on the approaching concrete monolith that rose from the Mississippi flatlands like a fortress from another age. In many ways, it was. Coldwater Correctional Facility, the privatized supermax that had made headlines for its cost-effective incarceration solutions and buried the stories of its body count just as efficiently. "You got a staring problem?" the guard asked, mistaking Ramsey's intensity for defiance. "Just taking in the view," Ramsey replied, his voice calm, measured. "Not much else to look at for the next 15 to 20. The van jerked to a stop in the processing bay. Ramsey had prepared himself for this moment during the months of appeals, rehearsing the motions in his mind until they became mechanical. Show no weakness. Betray no emotion. Survival meant becoming a canvas that reflected what others needed to see. Processing was a choreographed humiliation. Strip search, delousing, cavity check. Ramsey endured it all with a detached stoicism that unsettled the guards more than resistance would have. They were used to breaking men who fought. Men who accepted their fate with dignity were harder to read, harder to control. "Inmate 39847, Ramsey." A corrections officer with a clipboard checked his paperwork. "B block, Sergeant Kincaid's domain. Good luck with that." He smirked, the kind of expression that suggested Ramsey should understand the joke he'd just become. Sergeant Ray Kincaid stood at the elevated guard station overlooking B block, his kingdom of steel and concrete. 20 years in corrections had hardened him into a man who could read an inmate's breaking point like a weather vane. He watched his newest charge being escorted down the corridor, noting the measured stride, the careful way Ramsey's eyes cataloged everything without seeming to look at anything. "That's the professor?" Officer Nathan Hale asked, his voice carrying the tentative tone of all rookies on their first week. "Former professor," Kincaid corrected, his Mississippi drawl lingering on each syllable. "Now he's just 39847. He turned to study Hale, 24 years old, earnest face, shoulders that hadn't yet learned to carry the weight of the job. "What did they teach you at the academy about men like him?" Hale stiffened. "Sir? The educated ones. They come in here thinking the rules don't apply the same. They look for loopholes, organize others, trouble. They said to watch for. They Don't know shit, Kincaid cut him off. This is Coldwater, we got our own way of maintaining order. He gestured to the block below them. See Jenkins down there? Class A shitbird. Got him for armed robbery, attempted murder. Thinks because his cousin runs with the vice lords he can do whatever he wants. Hale nodded, uncertain where this was leading. By the end of this week he's gonna learn different. You stick with me, you'll learn how we handle discipline around here. On the floor below, the escort team delivered Ramsey to his cell. Jerome, Mouse Carter, a wiry man with quick eyes and quicker hands, looked up from a dog-eared magazine as his new cellmate entered. Well, well, Mouse drawled, taking in Ramsey's composed demeanor. They told me I was getting a roomie, but they didn't mention no professor. He slid off the top bunk with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to move without being noticed. I'm Mouse. Ramsey, Malik replied, setting his meager belongings on the lower bunk. He didn't offer more, didn't explain the Teach nickname that had followed him inside. Information was currency and he wasn't spending yet. Mouse grinned, undeterred. Not much for talking, that's cool. You'll learn quick enough. In here the walls got ears and the guards got quotas. He gestured toward the cell door. That one there with the high and mighty walk? That's Kincaid. Runs this block like his daddy's plantation. Cross him and you'll find yourself taking a code red vacation. Ramsey arranged his thin blanket on the mattress, not looking up. Code red? Official record says inmate required. Isolation for behavioral correction, Mouse whispered, his voice dropping an octave. What it don't say is how many guards it takes to deliver that correction, or how many bones get corrected in the process. Ramsey nodded almost imperceptibly, filing the information away. Appreciate the orientation. The next morning, Ramsey waited in line for breakfast, observing the careful choreography of prison life. The racial divisions were clear, tables segregated by unspoken agreement, movements restricted to invisible boundaries that everyone instinctively understood. He accepted his tray, noting how the server's eyes flickered to someone behind him. Turning, he found Kincaid watching him with the patient assessment of a predator. Heard you put in for law library access, Kincaid said, sidling up next to him in line. Awful eager considering you just got here. Just trying to make productive use of my time, officer, Ramsey replied evenly. Kincaid's smile never reached his eyes. Request denied. New inmates have a 30-day orientation period before special privileges. Policy. He emphasized the final word, making it clear this was his policy, not Coldwater's. Ramsey nodded, accepting the small defeat without comment. The exchange hadn't been about books. It was Kincaid's first test, probing for reactions, looking for weaknesses. As Ramsey took his seat at one of the tables designated for black inmates, he noted the young guard Hale, watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. The rookie's face was an open book, discomfort at Kincaid's petty display of power, uncertainty about his own role in this ecosystem. Interesting, Ramsey thought. Kincaid's own shadow had cracks in its foundation. Nathan Hale had joined Coldwater Correctional for the steady paycheck and benefits, not out of any calling to corrections. 6 months out of community college with an associate's degree in criminal justice and a mountain of student debt, the private prison corporation's hiring bonus had seemed like a lifeline. 2 weeks in, he was beginning to question his choice. Keep up, Hale, Kincaid barked as they made their afternoon rounds. Eyes sharp, these animals can smell weakness. Hale quickened his pace, noticing how inmates either cowered or glared as Kincaid passed. There was no middle ground, no normal interaction. Just fear or hatred. Sir, Hale ventured, I was looking through the policy manual last night and I noticed some discrepancies between the written procedures and what we... Manuals for the corporate visitors and state inspectors, Kincaid interrupted. Real corrections work happens in the gaps between pages. He stopped suddenly, focusing on an inmate who'd been watching them too intently, Jenkins, the one Kincaid had pointed out earlier. You got something to say, 45392? Jenkins, a muscular man with intricate tattoos crawling up his neck, didn't lower his gaze. Nah, boss man. Just admiring the new blood you got trailing you. His eyes flickered to Hale, lips curled in a smirk. Hope he lasts longer than the last one. Kincaid's posture shifted subtly, something Hale was learning to recognize as the prelude to trouble. Cell check, now. As they approached Jenkins's cell, Kincaid keyed his radio. Need assistance for compliance check, B block, cell 23. His voice was casual, almost bored, but 4 officers responded immediately, converging from different parts of the block. What's the procedure here? Hale asked, suddenly uneasy. Standard contraband search, Kincaid replied, but the glint in his eye told a different story. You're about to see how we handle discipline problems. The team of guards surrounded Jenkins, who had gone rigid but compliant. Kincaid made a show of searching the cell, methodically pulling apart the mattress, emptying the small locker, scattering personal items. When he reached under the sink and withdrew his hand with an exaggerated gesture of discovery, Hale knew with sudden clarity that whatever Kincaid was holding hadn't been there before. Well, well, Kincaid drawled, displaying a crude shiv fashioned from a sharpened plastic spoon. Looks like 45392 is planning a party. Jenkins' face drained of color. That ain't mine, you planted that shit. And now we've got a discipline problem, Kincaid sighed, nodding to the other guards. Take him to medical. He's clearly agitated and needs to be evaluated. 2 guards seized Jenkins by the arms. The inmate's eyes went wide with panic. No, I didn't do nothing. Hale, new blood. You saw. Tell them. Hale froze, the man's desperate. Please cutting through his training. Before he could respond, Kincaid's hand clamped on his shoulder, steering him away. He's trying to manipulate you, Kincaid said quietly. That's what they do. Remember your training. As Jenkins was dragged away, his shouts echoing down the corridor, Hale caught a glimpse of Ramsey watching from his cell. Unlike the other inmates who averted their eyes or pressed against the bars for a better view of the spectacle, Ramsey's gaze was clinical, observant. For a moment their eyes met and Hale felt a strange sense of being evaluated. Come on, Kincaid said, breaking the moment. You need to witness this. Part of your education. The room they called medical was a sterile, windowless chamber in a quiet corner of the administrative wing. No cameras, no monitors. Just a steel table, a drain in the floor, and the smell of industrial bleach that never quite masked the underlying copper scent of blood. Jenkins was already strapped to the table when Kincaid led Hale inside. 3 guards stood at intervals around the room, faces impassive. Gentlemen, Kincaid nodded to them. Our friend Jenkins here has been disturbing the peace, threatening officers, concealing weapons, standard code red procedure. Hale's mouth went dry. Sir, I don't think... You're not here to think. Kincaid cut him off, his voice hardening. You're here to learn. Every prison has rules written on paper, and rules written in blood. Jenkins broke the second kind. He turned to the restrained inmate. Didn't you, boy? Jenkins thrashed against his restraints. I didn't do nothing. That's 3 counts of verbal insubordination, Kincaid noted calmly, pulling on a pair of leather gloves. Let's begin his correction. What followed burned itself into Hale's memory with nauseating clarity. The methodical brutality, the careful attention to areas that wouldn't show visible bruising, the practiced rhythm of pain punctuated by questions about Jenkins's affiliations and activities. It wasn't random violence, it was systematic, almost scientific in its application. Worse than the beating itself was Jenkins' transformation from defiance to broken pleas, and finally to the empty, hollow compliance that Kincaid seemed to be waiting for. Now, Kincaid said, removing his gloves when it was over. He understands the rules. Don't you, Jenkins? Yes, sir, came the whispered reply from swollen lips. Kincaid turned to Hale, whose face had gone pale. That's how order is maintained. That's what keeps us alive in a place filled with murderers and rapists. You understand? Hale managed a nod, though his stomach churned with acid and doubt. Good, because next time you'll be participating. All officers rotate through correction duty, no exceptions. When they returned to B Block, the atmosphere had changed. Word of Jenkins's medical evaluation had already spread, carried through. The mysterious osmosis of prison communication. Inmates averted their eyes as Kincaid passed. Conversations died to whispers and tension hung in the air like smoke. Ramsey sat on his bunk, reading a worn paperback that had been left by a previous occupant. He didn't look up when Mouse slipped into their cell, moving with the furtive quickness that had earned him his nickname. "Jenkins got the treatment," Mouse whispered, settling on the floor with his back against the wall. "Word is he crossed." Kincaid questioned his authority in front of the new fish. Ramsey turned a page. "Seems excessive for a comment." "That's how it starts," Mouse replied. "First time's a warning to everyone else. Next time's to break you. There won't be a third time. Either you're broken or you're dead." He studied Ramsey with new interest. "You ain't scared?" "Fear's a luxury I can't afford," Ramsey said, finally looking up from his book. "Not for the next 15 years. Mouse's eyes widened slightly. "You different," he decided. "Most fish come in here, thinking they'll fight or they'll hide. You just watching, like you taking notes for a test later." Ramsey allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Old habits. The conversation died as Officer Hale appeared at their cell, making evening rounds. His face was still pale, his movements stiff with what Ramsey recognized as repressed shock. "Everything in order?" Hale asked, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Yes, sir," Mouse answered quickly, casting his eyes downward in the universal posture of prison submission. Ramsey held Hale's gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Just getting acquainted with my new home," he said mildly. Something flickered across Hale's face, discomfort, guilt, uncertainty. He moved on quickly, but Ramsey had seen what he needed to see. A crack in the system, a potential lever. After lights out, when the block settled into the restless quiet of hundreds of men pretending to sleep, Ramsey lay awake, mentally cataloging everything he'd observed. Guard rotations, informal power structures, the dynamics between officers, the invisible boundaries between inmate factions. 15 years was a death sentence if he accepted it passively. But information was power, and patience was his weapon. In the darkness, he began to plot his first move. Above him, Mouse's voice drifted down, barely audible. "You ain't just gonna survive in here, are you, Teach?" Ramsey closed his eyes. "One day at a time, Mouse. One day at a time." But they both knew it was more than survival now. Jenkins broken. Body and Hale's shaken conscience had confirmed what Ramsey had suspected since his conviction. The system wasn't just flawed, it was rotten to its core. And somewhere in that corruption lay the path to both justice and freedom. Tomorrow he would begin to pry it open. The morning after Jenkins's correction, silence hung heavy over B Block. Men moved with careful precision during breakfast, eyes downcast, voices hushed. Ramsey stood in the meal line, absorbing the atmosphere of controlled terror that permeated the room. Jenkins was nowhere to be seen, still in medical, according to Mouse's whispered intelligence network. Ramsey accepted his tray of lukewarm eggs and congealed oatmeal, his mind already mapping the day's objective. 3 days into his sentence, and Coldwater's rhythms were becoming clear. The guards who could be manipulated, the blind spots in surveillance, the precise moments when attention shifted, all useful data points in a system he intended to exploit. "Professor." The voice startled him from his calculations. Officer Hale stood beside his table, shoulders tense, eyes still haunted from yesterday's brutality. "Something wrong, officer?" Ramsey asked, careful to keep his tone neutral, respectful. "Your library request came through," Hale said, sliding a yellow permission slip across the table. 30 minutes after breakfast. Kincaid approved it this morning. Ramsey kept his face impassive, though inwardly he registered surprise. He'd resubmitted the request expecting another denial, a pretext to document the arbitrary application of prison policies. Kincaid's approval was unexpected. "Thank you," he said, pocketing the slip. "I appreciate it." Hale lingered a moment longer than necessary. "What exactly did you teach before?" He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "Ethics and philosophy. Ramsey replied, watching Hale's reaction. Moral reasoning, systems of justice, the construction of institutional power. A small calculated risk, revealing just enough to pique interest. Something flickered in Hale's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a question forming. 30 minutes, Hale repeated, and moved on to the next table. Across the cafeteria, Kincaid watched the exchange, his face unreadable. The Coldwater Library was a sad collection of donated paperbacks, outdated encyclopedias, and carefully censored magazines, crammed into a converted storage room with flickering fluorescent lights. But it had something more valuable than books. Winston Green, a 60-year-old lifer who had been Coldwater's unofficial librarian for 15 years. "New blood wants the law section," announced the guard escorting Ramsey, a board officer who immediately retreated to a plastic chair by the door, immersing himself in a dog-eared sports magazine. Green, a tall, gaunt black man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses held together with tape, appraised Ramsey silently over the top of a cart of books he was sorting. "Law section's in the back," Green said, his voice a low rumble. "Such as it is." Ramsey nodded his thanks and made his way to the rear of the room, where a small collection of legal texts sat on a dusty shelf. As he'd hoped, Green followed, ostensibly to shelve books in the same area. "You the professor they've been talking about," Green said, not a question. His hands moved methodically, ordering books that were already arranged. "Word travels." "Malik Ramsey," he confirmed, selecting a volume on appellate procedures that looked suitably dense. "I hear you know Coldwater better than the builders." Green's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I seen 5 wardens come and go, dozen sergeants like Kincaid, some worse, some better, all the same system." Ramsey opened the book, pretending to scan its pages while lowering his voice. "I heard someone filed a grievance against Kincaid last year. Official channels." Green's hands stilled momentarily on the spine of a book. Man might have ended up with 3 broken ribs and a detached retina for his trouble, too. He resumed his shelving. "Why you asking?" "I'm trying to understand how things work here." "They work like they designed to work," Green replied, bitterness seeping into his carefully measured tone. "You smart enough to know that." Ramsey nodded, turning a page. "I also know systems have flaws. Documentation, for instance. Records, patterns that can't be erased." He glanced toward the guard, still absorbed in his magazine. "Especially when those patterns leave evidence." Green's eyes narrowed, studying Ramsey with new intensity. "Most men who come in here with ideas about changing things learn quick that surviving is victory enough. I'm not most men." "No," Green agreed after a moment. "I expect you ain't." He selected a book from his cart, a battered copy of Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and placed it deliberately on the shelf beside Ramsey. "Page 47 might interest you. Thoreau had some thoughts worth considering." Ramsey took the book, understanding the message. "I've always appreciated his perspective." "Your 30 minutes starts running thin," Green warned, moving his cart away. But before leaving, he added quietly, "Cell Block D 118 Jackson." He kept copies. Ramsey tucked both books under his arm, a small victory forming beneath his composed exterior. First contact made. Now he needed to find a way to reach D Block. Back in his cell, Ramsey sat cross-legged on his bunk, Thoreau open before him. Page 47 contained no hidden message or map. It didn't need to. The passage itself was the message. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. Passive resistance wasn't enough in Coldwater. But the principle remained sound. Documentation, evidence, exposure. The system's violence turned against itself. Between the pages, he found a small scrap of paper with a single word. Tuesday. D Block's library day, presumably. Green was offering access. Mouse entered, his movements jittery with nervous energy. "Man, you pushin' it," he whispered, glancing toward the open cell door. Kincaid's been asking about you all morning. What books you requested, why you talking to Hale? Ramsey closed Thoreau carefully. Let him ask. You don't get it, Mouse persisted, sitting on the concrete floor, back against the wall as usual. He ain't just another guard with a power trip. Man's got a system. First he watches, learns your habits, your connections. Then he tests. Small shit, see how you react. Then he breaks you, makes an example. Rinse and repeat. And how far am I in this process? He watching, Mouse replied grimly. Jenkins was the breaking for last month's new arrivals. You next on the rotation, I can feel it. Ramsey nodded thoughtfully. Then we need to accelerate my schedule. I need eyes in D block. Mouse's eyes widened. You crazy? We B block. Ain't no crossing over without official transfers. Kitchen duty, laundry, medical. Kitchen's all C block. Laundry, Mouse considered. I know a guy runs a cigarette hustle through laundry. Could maybe get a message out, but it'll cost. What's the currency? Protection mostly. Favors. Smokes if you got 'em. Ramsey reached beneath his thin mattress and extracted a small, tightly folded square of paper. The permission slip Hale had given him, which he'd carefully palmed from his pocket and replaced with a blank one. On the back he'd written a simple message. Jackson, Green said you kept copies. I'm building a case. Tuesday? He handed it to Mouse. Tell your laundry connection I can protect him from Kincaid when this plays out. He'll understand the value. Mouse stared at him, something like admiration mixing with fear in his expression. You ain't just talking, are you? You really going after the man? I'm going after the system, Ramsey corrected. Kincaid's just one moving part. The following day brought Officer Hale back to their cell during afternoon count. He paused at the doorway, his clipboard a convenient prop for lingering. Finished Thoreau already? He asked, gesturing to the book on Ramsey's shelf. An old friend, Ramsey replied. Familiar passages. I read him in college, civil disobedience mostly. And what did you think of his arguments? Hale shifted uncomfortably, aware of other guards moving down the tier. Idealistic. Impractical in the real world. Perhaps, Ramsey conceded. Or perhaps the real world makes his arguments more necessary, not less. Something passed between them then, not quite understanding but a recognition. Hale had seen behind the curtain of Coldwater's justice system and was struggling to reconcile it with his own moral compass. I've requested another book, Ramsey said, changing direction. Camus, The Stranger. Never read it. It's about a man condemned by society for failing to show the expected emotions. The system punishes him not for his crime, but for his refusal to play his assigned role. Ramsey held Hale's gaze. You might find it illuminating. Before Hale could respond, Kincaid's voice boomed from the tier below. Hale, you taking a census or counting heads? Move it! Hale marked his clipboard hastily. Cell clear, he muttered, and moved on. Mouse, who had been silently watching from the corner, whistled low. Man, what game you playing? That guard is Kincaid's project, his eyes and ears. For now, Ramsey agreed. But he's something Kincaid will never be. What's that? Redeemable. Tuesday brought the response Ramsey had been waiting for. During lunch, Mouse slid onto the bench beside him, carefully passing a folded slip of paper beneath the table. Jackson says he'll meet. Library, 2 p.m. Says he's got something you need to see, but it's going to cost more than promises. Ramsey pocketed the note. What's he want? Protection's not enough. He wants out of D block. Says Kincaid's got friends. They're making his life hell since the grievance. A transfer isn't something I can arrange. He knows, Mouse replied. But he says you're smart enough to figure it out if you're serious. Ramsey considered this challenge as he mechanically ate the bland prison food. A transfer required administrative approval, documentation, a paper trail, all things beyond an inmate's direct control. But systems had leverage points, especially bureaucratic ones. His contemplation was interrupted by a commotion near the serving line. A young Latino inmate was being dragged from the cafeteria by 2 guards, his protests cut short by a baton, to the ribs. "Contraband," Mouse murmured, watching the scene. "Garcia's been running a side hustle, smuggling in pills through his kitchen duty. Guess they finally caught him." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ramsey observed Kincaid emerging from a side door, his posture radiating satisfaction as he surveyed the disruption. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Ramsey felt a chill of recognition. Kincaid nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that said, "I haven't forgotten you." "There goes another one to medical," Mouse sighed. "Not necessarily," Ramsey countered, watching the guard's trajectory. "They're taking him to administration." "That's new. Kincaid usually handles discipline in-house, unless he's putting on a show," Ramsey said thoughtfully. "Who's watching today?" Mouse glanced around the cafeteria, his practiced eye picking out details others would miss. "State inspector, table by the wall, clipboard lady trying not to. Look like she's counting the cockroaches." Ramsey smiled faintly. "Convenient timing for a contraband bust handled by the book, wouldn't you say?" The wheels were turning now. If the administration was sensitive to outside scrutiny, that created possibilities, pressure points in the system that could be exploited. The library meeting with Jackson nearly didn't happen. An hour before Ramsey's scheduled library time, the block was locked down for an impromptu cell search. Guards moved methodically down the tier, tearing apart each cell with practiced efficiency. Ramsey sat calmly on his bunk as two officers upended his meager possessions, flipping through, his books and running gloved hands along seams and edges. "What are they looking for?" he asked Mouse when the guards moved to the next cell. "Nothing specific," Mouse replied, reorganizing his scattered belongings. "It's a show of force. Reminder that nothing here is really yours, not even your space." The lockdown lifted just in time for Ramsey's library period. As he was escorted down the corridor, he noticed Kincaid watching from the guard station, his expression calculating. In the library, the same bored guard took his position by the door, immediately becoming absorbed in his magazine. Green was shelving books nearby, his back deliberately turned to create a small pocket of privacy near the law section. Jackson was already there, a stocky man with a jagged scar across his left cheek and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He pretended to browse as Ramsey approached. "You Ramsey?" he muttered without looking up. "Yes. Green says you're building something against Kincaid." "Against the whole system," Ramsey clarified. "Kincaid's just a symptom." Jackson snorted softly. "Tell that to my retina." He glanced toward the guard, then back to the shelves. "I filed a proper grievance, followed every procedure. 2 days later, I'm in medical with self-inflicted injuries on my record." "You kept copies?" "Ain't that stupid," Jackson confirmed. "Original grievance, medical report, witness statement I got from another inmate before he was transferred. Out. Even the dismissal notice, signature doesn't match the officer who supposedly investigated." "Where is it?" "Somewhere safe. Question is, what you gonna do with it that I couldn't?" Ramsey selected a law book, using it to partially shield their conversation. "I'm creating a pattern. One grievance gets dismissed. Dozens with supporting evidence, medical documentation, guard testimony. That's harder to bury." "Guard testimony?" Jackson looked skeptical. "Man, you're living in a fantasy. There's a new officer, Hale. He witnessed a code red on Jenkins. He's disturbed by it." "Being disturbed and testifying are planets apart." "Everyone has a breaking point," Ramsey countered, "even the ones giving the orders." Jackson considered, this eye still scanning for any attention from the guard or cameras. "I need that transfer. D-Block's killing me by inches." "I need to create an administrative problem," Ramsey explained. "Something that requires reshuffling inmates for plausible reasons. Give me 2 weeks. I could be dead in 2 weeks. Then, help me work faster," Ramsey pressed. "I need those documents, and I need to know who else has filed grievances, who's witnessed code reds, who's got evidence hidden away." Jackson weighed his options, the calculation visible in his tense features. Finally, he reached into the binding of the book he was holding and extracted a tightly folded paper. Not the documents, he clarified as Ramsey took it. Names. Inmates who filed complaints got shut down and paid the price. Most are still here, transferred to different blocks. Some ain't talking anymore, beaten too bad or bought off. But it's a start. Ramsey pocketed the list. I'll make contact, build the network. And my transfer? Give me a week. I'll create an opportunity. As they concluded their exchange, Green approached with his cart. Time's about up, he warned quietly, and Kincaid just came in. Ramsey turned to see the sergeant speaking with the guard at the door, deliberately casual but eyes scanning the library. Their time was up. One more thing, Jackson whispered urgently. There's a rumor. Kincaid's got a book, a record. Every code red, every inmate, every reason. Keeps score like it's a game. Ramsey's pulse quickened. Where? No one knows for sure. Office maybe, or his locker, but it exists. Torres saw it before they transferred him out. The guard at the door was standing now, responding to Kincaid's instructions. Ramsey, time's up. Ramsey nodded to Jackson and Green, tucking a law book under his arm as if that had been his purpose all along. As he approached the exit, Kincaid blocked his path. Productive research, Professor? He asked, eyes cold with suspicion. Very, Ramsey replied evenly. I'm particularly interested in administrative regulations regarding inmate grievance procedures. Something dangerous flashed in Kincaid's expression. Planning to file a complaint? Just educating myself on the system, isn't that the point of rehabilitation? There's education, Kincaid said softly, and there's agitation, thin line between them. I've always been a careful student. Kincaid stepped aside, allowing Ramsey to pass. We'll see about that. Back in his cell, Ramsey unfolded Jackson's list. 12 names, spread across all 5 housing blocks. 12 men who had tried to use the system's own rules against it and failed. 12 potential allies, or liabilities. Mouse returned from his work assignment, immediately reading the tension in Ramsey's posture. Bad news? Complicated news, Ramsey corrected. Kincaid's watching closely now, and I need to manufacture a reason for a mass inmate transfer within the week. Mouse let out a low whistle. Only thing that causes that kind of shuffle is a security breach or infrastructure problem. Something that makes a block uninhabitable. Ramsey smiled faintly. Precisely. Before Mouse could respond, their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the tier below. Guards were dragging a thrashing inmate toward the block exit. Garcia, the contraband suspect from earlier. His face was bloody, his shirt torn. Thought they took him to administration, Mouse said, confused. They did, Ramsey replied grimly. For show. Now the inspector's gone. It's time for the real punishment. Mouse shook his head. Man had 10 Xanax tablets. Minor offense usually loses privileges for a month. It's not about the offense, Ramsey observed. It's about the opportunity. From their vantage point, they could see Officer Hale standing rigid near the guard station, watching Garcia's violent extraction with poorly concealed distress. When Kincaid emerged from his office and gestured for Hale to follow the punishment detail, the young guard's reluctance was palpable. Your boy don't look eager, Mouse noted. He's going to witness his second code red, Ramsey said. And this time Kincaid will expect him to participate. They watched Hale trail after the group, his movements stiff with dread. When they disappeared from view, Mouse turned to Ramsey with newfound respect. You called it. This is his test. And if he fails, Kincaid will remove him from the equation, Ramsey concluded. I need to accelerate our timeline. He pulled out the Thoreau book, opening it to a blank page in the back. From beneath his mattress, he withdrew a small pencil nub he'd secreted away and began to write in tiny, precise letters. Day 4. Witnessed extraction of inmate Garcia, cell block B, for alleged medication contraband. Official report filed with administration during inspector visit. Subsequent unauthorized discipline initiated 1417 hours. Officers involved Kincaid, Reynolds, Whitman, Hale, probationary. Documentation continues. It wasn't much, just the beginning of a pattern. But patterns were what the system feared most. Irrefutable evidence of its own mechanized cruelty. "What now?" Mouse asked, watching Ramsey conceal the makeshift journal. "Now," Ramsey replied, "we create a problem that requires administrative attention. How's the plumbing in D block?" Mouse's eyes widened with understanding. "Old, real old. Sewage backed up twice last year." "And what would happen if it failed catastrophically?" A slow grin spread across Mouse's face. "Mass transfer while they fix it. Every inmate redistributed. Including Jackson." "You gonna flood D block? How? We can barely get messages there, let alone sabotage the plumbing." Ramsey lay back on his bunk, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "We don't need to touch the plumbing. We just need the administration to believe there's a critical failure. Paperwork," Mouse realized. "Maintenance requests, emergency work orders. Systems run on documentation," Ramsey confirmed. "Change the documentation, you change reality." As the cell block settled into afternoon routine, Ramsey's mind raced with possibilities. The path forward was taking shape. Gather evidence, build allies, create pressure, expose the pattern. Kincaid's ledger, if it existed, would be the final piece. But first, he needed to solidify his connection to Hale. The young guard was about to face a critical moral test in the medical room. Whether he participated in Garcia's correction or resisted, the experience would leave him vulnerable. Vulnerable people made decisions based on emotion rather than calculation, and emotional decisions could be guided by the right voice at the right moment. "Mouse," Ramsey said quietly, "I need to know exactly when Officer Hale returns from medical, and what condition he's in." "Already on it," Mouse replied, moving to the cell door to activate his network of eyes and ears. Somebody always watching. In Coldwater, that was the one certainty. Someone was always watching. Ramsey was counting on it. The day after Garcia's punishment, Officer Hale returned to duty with shadows under his eyes and trembling hands that he tried to hide in his pockets. Ramsey observed him during morning count, noting the way he avoided eye contact with inmates, the slight hesitation before each cell, the signs of a conscience in crisis. "He participated," Mouse whispered when Hale moved past their cell. "Word is Kincaid made him throw the first punch. Baptism by blood." Ramsey nodded, unsurprised. Kincaid was methodical in breaking his subordinates, the same way he broke inmates. Create complicity, then leverage it against future resistance. "How's Garcia?" "Infirmary. Busted ribs. Concussion. They're saying he fell repeatedly during a seizure." Ramsey's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of his anger. "And our D block project?" Mouse's eyes gleamed. "In motion. My laundry connection planted the first maintenance request yesterday. Emergency sewage backup, signed by a maintenance supervisor who's on vacation this week." "Good. We need 2 more from different sources to establish a pattern. Already got Delgado and C block working on it. 3rd one's trickier. Leave it to me," Ramsey said, his attention returning to Hale, who had frozen momentarily at another cell staring at nothing. "We have a more immediate opportunity." During yard time, Ramsey positioned himself near the fence where Hale had been stationed. For 20 minutes, he simply stood watching the basketball game, seemingly lost in thought. Then, with careful timing, he approached the fence. "Officer Hale." Hale turned, his face tightening with recognition and something else. Shame, perhaps. "Ramsey, you need something?" "Just some air that doesn't smell like industrial cleaner and unwashed bodies," Ramsey replied, keeping his tone conversational. Then lowering his voice, "How's your conscience this morning?" Hale stiffened, eyes darting to check if anyone was watching their exchange. "You're out of line, inmate." "We're all out of line in Coldwater," Ramsey countered. "Some by choice, some by circumstance. You had to make a choice yesterday, didn't you?" "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I can see it in your hands." Ramsey nodded toward Hale's trembling fingers. "What did they make you do to Garcia? Hold him down? Take a turn with the baton?" Or just watch and do nothing? Hale's face drained of color. Shut your mouth or I'll write you up. For what? Asking uncomfortable questions? Go ahead. Documentation creates patterns, Officer Hale. Patterns reveal truth. And the truth about Coldwater is written in men's bodies, not in reports. Something broke in Hale's expression, a hairline fracture in his professional facade. You can't understand. There are rules here. Expectations. Expectations like beating a man for a handful of pills? Is that what you signed up for at the academy? It wasn't. Hale stopped himself, the professional mask slipping back into place, but not before Ramsey glimpsed the turmoil beneath. It wasn't what? Ramsey pressed. Justified, necessary, legal? Get back to the game, Ramsey. This conversation is over. Ramsey held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. For now. As he turned to walk away, he added quietly, Camus wrote that we all have a plague within us. No one is immune, but some of us choose to be healers instead of spreaders. He moved back toward the basketball court, leaving Hale visibly shaken. The seed was planted. You're playing a dangerous game, Mouse warned when Ramsey returned to their cell after yard time. Guard like Hale caught between Kincaid and his conscience, he's unpredictable. Might lash out at you just to prove his loyalty. Possible, Ramsey acknowledged, but unlikely. He's not a true believer like Kincaid. He's a man who took a job and found himself in moral quicksand. Still don't see how this gets us what we need. We need evidence, Ramsey explained, keeping his voice low. Documented patterns of abuse. One man's testimony can be dismissed. One recording, one incident, not enough. We need multiple vectors of proof. And Hale's gonna help with that how. He has access, movement, authority to be places we can't. And most importantly, he has a conscience that's bleeding. Mouse shook his head skeptically. Man, you playing chess when everyone else is playing checkers. No, Ramsey corrected grimly. Kincaid's playing chess too. He's just never had an opponent who could see the whole board. 3 days later, the D-Block project bore fruit. The administration discovered the third maintenance request about critical sewage issues, triggering an emergency inspection. By afternoon, the entire block was being evacuated for repairs. Inmates temporarily redistributed throughout the facility. Jackson's coming to B-Block, Mouse reported, his network of informants earning their cigarettes. Assigned to the east. Tier Cell 43. Ramsey nodded, satisfied with this small victory. Now we accelerate. You ready for this? Mouse asked, studying Ramsey's calm demeanor. Once you provoke a code red, there's no controlling how bad it gets. These guards ain't known for restraint. I'm counting on that, Ramsey replied. Their excess is our evidence. Mouse produced a small object from his waistband, a crude audio recorder fashioned from a modified MP3 player that had been smuggled in months ago. This is all I could get. Sound quality's for shit, and it only records for 20 minutes before the battery dies. It's enough, Ramsey said, examining the device. Now came the hardest part, getting it to Hale. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, as inmates lined up for dinner count, Officer Hale was assigned to their tier. Ramsey had positioned himself strategically at the end of the line, ensuring Hale would reach him last. When the young guard finally stood before their cell, his clipboard raised, Ramsey made his move. I finished Camus, he said quietly. Hale hesitated, then checked their names off the list. Good for you. The prosecutor condemns Mersault not for his crime, but for his failure to play by society's rules. His inability to show the expected emotions. Ramsey held Hale's gaze. Sound familiar? I don't know what you're talking about. But Hale's voice lacked conviction. Garcia isn't the last one they'll make you hurt, Ramsey continued, his voice barely above a whisper. There will be more. Each time it gets easier, until one day you're Kincaid. Hale's shoulders tensed. Careful, Ramsey. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'm going to create a situation, a controlled demonstration of Coldwater justice. All you have to do is be in the right place with the right tool. Ramsey gestured subtly to the small recorder Mouse was palming. Evidence of what's really happening here. You're insane, Hale hissed. That's conspiracy. I could lose my job, go to jail. And how many men will lose years of their lives, or their lives entirely, if nothing changes? Ramsey countered. You've seen what happens in medical. You've participated in it. The question is, are you going to remain complicit or help stop it? For a moment, genuine conflict played across Hale's features. Fear, uncertainty, a flicker of moral resolve. Last check, called another guard from the tier below. Wrap it up, Hale. Think about it, Ramsey said. Cell block supply closet, 9 a.m. tomorrow. If you're the man I think you are, you'll be there. Hale moved on without responding, but the rigid set of his shoulders told Ramsey everything he needed to know. The hook was set. Morning brought lockdown for a random contraband search, standard procedure, but the timing made Ramsey nervous. If Hale couldn't access the supply closet, the entire plan would collapse. Kincaid's got a hard-on for something, Mouse observed as guards tore through the cell across from theirs. This is the third search this week. Ramsey nodded outwardly, calm despite his internal calculations. The lockdown needed to end by 9:30 for his plan to work. Each passing minute increased the risk. At 8:55, the all-clear finally sounded. Inmates were released for their morning assignments: laundry, kitchen, maintenance. Ramsey had been assigned to corridor cleaning detail, perfect for his purposes. It's on, he murmured to Mouse as a guard arrived to escort the cleaning crew. Mouse nodded grimly. Be careful, Teach. These beatings ain't for show. I'm counting on it. The supply closet was empty when Ramsey managed to slip away from his cleaning detail, feigning a search for more detergent. He waited, seconds ticking by, doubt creeping in. Had he misjudged Hale? Overestimated the young guard's moral courage? The door opened. Hale stood there, pale but resolute. You have 2 minutes, he said tersely. Then I'm reporting that I found you here unauthorized. Ramsey nodded. Did you bring it? Hale hesitated, then reached into his pocket and produced the small recorder. This is suicide. For both of us. It's the only way to break the cycle, Ramsey countered, taking the device. Hide it in medical. Under the supply cabinet in the corner, it'll capture everything. And you? What exactly are you planning to do? Something minor but visible. Enough to trigger the system without risking lethal force. Hale's jaw tightened. They don't calibrate their response based on the offense. You know that. I'm counting on it, Ramsey repeated. All you have to do is retrieve the recorder afterward. Can you access medical unobserved? Maybe. Kincaid assigns the detail, but sometimes lets me handle the paperwork. If I volunteer... Good. Be ready. 10 a.m. Ramsey moved toward the door, then paused. Why are you helping? Hale's expression darkened. Because I can't sleep. Because every time I close my eyes, I see Garcia's face when I... He stopped, unable to continue. Just do what you have to do. At precisely 10 a.m., Ramsey initiated his plan. He was mopping the corridor outside the guard station when Officer Reynolds, one of Kincaid's most loyal deputies, approached. You missed a spot, Reynolds said, deliberately dragging his boot through the wet floor. Ramsey continued mopping, saying nothing. You deaf, Professor? Reynolds moved closer. I said you missed a spot. Ramsey looked up, meeting his gaze. I heard you, officer. Then do it again. Right. I'm doing it exactly as instructed, Ramsey replied, his voice level but carrying enough to be heard by nearby inmates and guards. If you have a specific technique you prefer, perhaps you could demonstrate. Reynolds' face darkened. You giving me lip, boy? I'm requesting clarification on your instructions, sir. Ramsey kept his tone respectful, but his steady gaze was a challenge that Reynolds couldn't miss. Put down the mop. Have I done something wrong, officer? By now, other inmates had stopped their work, sensing the confrontation building. A guard at the station had picked up his radio. "I said put down the damn mop." Reynolds grabbed Ramsey's arm. With careful calculation, Ramsey tensed, but didn't resist. "I'm following orders, sir. I was assigned to clean this corridor." "And?" "Now you're being reassigned," Reynolds snarled, wrenching the mop from Ramsey's hands. "To medical, for evaluation." "On what grounds?" Ramsey asked, loud enough for witnesses. "Insubordination, threatening a corrections officer." "I've done neither of those things," Ramsey stated calmly. "And there are witnesses to this interaction." That was the final provocation. Reynolds's face contorted with rage as he shoved Ramsey against the wall. "Resisting. I need backup." Within seconds, 2 more guards appeared. Ramsey allowed himself to be restrained, offering just enough tension to justify their force without actually fighting back. As they dragged him toward the administration wing, he caught sight of Kincaid emerging from his office, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth. The trap was set. Now everything depended on Hale. The medical room was exactly as Jenkins had described it. Sterile, windowless, with its ominous steel table and drain in the floor. Ramsey was strapped down, his arms and legs secured with thick leather restraints. Reynolds and another guard stood by the door while a third checked the restraints. "Nice and tight," the guard said, cinching the strap across Ramsey's chest until it bit into his flesh. "Don't want our professor getting uncomfortable." Ramsey scanned the room, looking for the recorder. There, a small shadow beneath the supply cabinet in the corner. Hale had come through. The door opened and Kincaid entered, surveying the scene with clinical detachment. "Mr. Ramsey, I'm disappointed. Not even 2 weeks in and already causing problems." "What seems to be the problem?" "Sergeant?" Ramsey asked, maintaining his composure. "I was simply performing my assigned duties." "Officer Reynolds reports insubordination, verbal threats, and resistance during restraint." Kincaid circled the table slowly. "Serious infractions, especially for someone with your academic background." "I made no threats. I was respectful and compliant. There are witnesses. The only witnesses that matter are in this room," Kincaid replied, pulling on a pair of leather gloves identical to those he'd worn during Jenkins' beating. "And we all saw a dangerous display of aggression from an inmate with a history of violence." "I have no history of violence," Ramsey countered. "My record is clear on that." Kincaid's smile was cold. "Records can be amended. Memories fade. But lessons," he flexed his gloved fingers, "lessons tend to stick." The first blow caught Ramsey in the ribs, a calculated strike that knocked the air from his lungs. He gasped, fighting the instinct to struggle against his restraints. "You think you're smarter than the system," Kincaid said conversationally, nodding to Reynolds, who stepped forward with a baton. "They all do. The educated ones. They think they can game it, find the loopholes." Another blow, this time to Ramsey's thigh. "But the system was designed by men smarter than you. Men who understood that order requires consequences." Ramsey forced himself to focus on his breathing, on the recorder capturing every word. Each blow was evidence. Each moment of pain was purpose. "Nothing to say, Professor?" Kincaid asked, gripping Ramsey's jaw. "No philosophical observations about the nature of power?" "Just one," Ramsey managed through clenched teeth. "Power that requires violence to maintain itself is already failing." Kincaid's expression hardened. "Educate him," he instructed the guards, stepping back. "I have a meeting with the warden. 20 minutes, no permanent damage. He needs to walk out of here." As Kincaid left, closing the door behind him, Reynolds grinned down at Ramsey. 20 minutes is a long time, Professor. Let's see how many lessons we can fit in." What followed was methodical brutality, precise strikes to soft tissue, careful pressure on nerve clusters, techniques designed to maximize pain while minimizing visible evidence. Ramsey retreated into his mind, focusing on a single thought. This is necessary. This is evidence. This will end. Hours later, back in his cell, Ramsey lay on his bunk, breathing shallowly through bruised ribs. Mouse sat beside him, applying a EID, cold compress fashioned from a damp towel filled with ice smuggled from the kitchen. "Man, they worked you over good," Mouse muttered, his eyes angry. "But they were careful. No marks above the collar, nothing that would show in an inspection." "Professional," Ramsey agreed, his voice hoarse. "How long?" "Hale brought you back 4 hours ago. Said you had a medical episode during questioning." Ramsey nodded slightly, the movement sending pain lancing through his skull. "And?" Mouse reached beneath his mattress and extracted the small recorder. "He came through. Said it was under the cabinet just like you planned. Whole thing's recorded." Despite his pain, Ramsey felt a surge of triumph. "Does it work? Is it clear?" Mouse pressed play, and Kincaid's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, tinny but unmistakable. "The only witnesses that matter are in this room, and we all saw a dangerous display of aggression from an inmate with a history of violence." "It worked," Ramsey whispered. "First piece of evidence secured." "Yeah, at the cost of your ribs and who knows what else," Mouse countered, shutting off the recorder. "Was it worth it?" Ramsey closed his eyes, feeling each pulse of pain as a reminder of purpose. "Ask me when Kincaid's in handcuffs." "If you say so." Mouse hid the recorder in their toilet tank, sealed in a waterproof bag. Word spreading. "Inmates are talking about how you stood up to Reynolds, didn't break. Even the guards are noticing." "Good. Attention creates witnesses. Also creates targets," Mouse warned. "Kincaid's on high alert. Doubled the random searches, restricted movement between blocks. Man's hunting for something." Ramsey nodded, having expected this. He suspects there's a leak, information flowing beyond his control. "What now?" Ramsey shifted, wincing as pain shot through his side. "Now we escalate. The tape proves Kincaid's methods, but we need more. We need his network, his protection, his leverage points." "You talking about Tank?" Mouse said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tank Willis. The man controls the yard, has influence with both guards and inmates, and according to my sources, he's done favors for Kincaid in the past." Mouse's eyes widened. "Man, that's suicide. Tank's got 3 bodies on his record, and those are just the ones they could prove. He'd snap you in half." "Not if I have something he wants more than my fear," Ramsey countered. "Information about his brothers, death at Coldwater 2 years ago." "How you know about that?" "Jackson's list included a Torres, transferred out after witnessing a code red that went too far. The victim was Willis, Devin Willis." Mouse fell silent, processing this revelation. "Tank thinks his brother OD'd. Official report said heroin smuggled in by another inmate. And if that report was fiction, if Devin Willis was another code red that got out of hand, then Tank would burn this place to the ground to get the truth," Mouse agreed, a new respect in his eyes. "But you're playing with fire, Teach. Manipulating a man like Tank. There's no controlling that rage once it's loose." Ramsey met his gaze steadily. "I don't need to control it, I just need to aim it." Outside their cell, the evening count began, guards moving methodically down the tier. Ramsey lay back, allowing the pain to wash over him in waves, a reminder of what they were fighting against. One recording wasn't enough. They needed more. More evidence, more allies, more pressure points. And Tank Willis, the most feared inmate in Coldwater, was the key to all 3. 3 days after his medical evaluation, Ramsey returned to yard privileges, his body still aching but mobile enough to execute the next phase of his plan. Mouse had arranged the contact through an elaborate network of messages and favors. Tank, Willis would give him 5 minutes during basketball, no guarantees beyond that. Ramsey watched Tank from the sidelines of the concrete yard, studying the man who ruled Coldwater's inmate hierarchy through calculated violence and unwavering loyalty to his chosen few. 6'4", 250 pounds of prison-honed muscle, his dark skin marked with intricate tattoos that told the story of his rise through Mississippi's gang structures. Men gave him space without being told, guards watched him with wary respect, and even Kincaid maintained a careful distance. "That's your 5 minutes," Mouse murmured, appearing at Ramsey's side. "Northeast corner by the weights. Don't stare. Too hard beforehand. He notices everything. Ramsey nodded, moving casually around the perimeter of the yard. He felt eyes tracking him. Not just Tank's crew, but Kincaid's guards stationed along the fence. After his confrontation with Reynolds, they were watching him more closely. Tank was methodically curling a dumbbell when Ramsey approached, his back to the yard, two hulking associates positioned to block any surprise approach. They tensed as Ramsey drew near. "Professor wants an audience," one muttered to Tank, who didn't break his rhythm or turn around. "He got something worth my time?" Tank's voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, contrasting sharply with his imposing presence. "I have information about Devon," Ramsey said quietly. The dumbbell paused, mid-curl. Tank lowered it slowly, then turned to face Ramsey, his expression unreadable. "My brother's been dead 2 years. What could you possibly know?" "I know he didn't die from heroin," Ramsey replied, keeping his voice low. "I know it was a code red that went too far, and I know who ordered it." Something dangerous flashed in Tank's eyes. He nodded almost imperceptibly to his associates, who moved to create a human barrier between them and the nearest guard tower. "You got 30 seconds before I decide you're trying to play me," Tank said. "And nobody plays me, Professor." "Torres witnessed it," Ramsey said, invoking the name from Jackson's list. "He was transferred out after filing a grievance. The medical report was falsified. They claimed overdose to cover multiple organ failures from blunt force trauma. Devon knew something they couldn't let spread." Tank's massive hands clenched into fists. "Proof? I have copies of Torres's original statement, the suppressed grievance, and the initial medical assessment before it was amended. Devon was beaten. For over 30 minutes, the order came from Kincaid." A flicker of raw grief crossed Tank's otherwise impassive face. "Why are you bringing this to me now? What's your angle?" "I need allies," Ramsey answered honestly. "I'm building a case against Kincaid and the entire Coldwater disciplinary system. Your brother was one victim among dozens." Tank studied him with calculating intensity. "Meet me in the laundry. Tomorrow. 3rd shift." It wasn't a request. "I'm not assigned to laundry." A cold smile touched Tank's lips. "You will be." He turned back to his weights, signaling the end of their conversation. As Ramsey walked away, Tank added quietly, "You better not be lying, Professor, for your sake." "Your work assignment's been changed," the guard announced during evening count. "Laundry detail, 3rd shift tomorrow." Mouse looked at Ramsey with raised eyebrows as the guard moved on. "Man works fast," he whispered. "Tank's got pull with the work assignments coordinator." "Or Kincaid's setting a trap," Ramsey countered, considering the possibility. "Laundry's isolated, minimal supervision." "Could be both," Mouse agreed. "You still going through with it?" Ramsey nodded. "Have you secured the documents?" "Jackson came through. Got the originals from his hiding spot when they transferred him here." Mouse extracted a small packet wrapped in plastic from beneath his mattress. "Torres's statement, the initial medical report on Devon Willis, and something extra, a guard's unofficial incident report that never made it into the system." Ramsey took the packet, examining its contents carefully. The evidence was compelling. Clinical descriptions of injuries inconsistent with overdose, timestamps that contradicted the official report, and most damning, Torres' eyewitness account, naming the guards involved and Kincaid's direct orders. "Tank's gonna explode when he sees this," Mouse warned. "Man's kept it together all this time thinking his brother died from his own mistakes. Finding out it was murder. It's a calculated risk," Ramsey acknowledged. "His rage gives us leverage, but we need to channel it." "You playing with fire, Teach." "Sometimes you need to burn things down to rebuild," Ramsey replied, sealing the documents back in their waterproof wrapping. That night, Officer Hale appeared at their cell during his rounds, his posture rigid with tension. "Contraband check," he announced mechanically, though no other cells were being searched. As he methodically went through their meager possessions, he leaned close to Ramsey and whispered urgently, "Someone knows. Found a note in my locker." "Stop helping Ramsey or join him." Ramsey maintained a neutral expression. "Expected. Kincaid suspicious." Has the recording been secured? It's safe. Off-site. Hale straightened up, raising his voice. Clean. This time. He hesitated, then added quietly, "Be careful in laundry tomorrow. It's a trap." Before Ramsey could respond, Hale moved on, leaving him with the warning. Mouse, who had been watching from his bunk, raised an eyebrow. "Your boy's scared," he observed when Hale was out of earshot. "With good reason," Ramsey replied. "Kincaid's closing in." "So we abort the laundry meet?" Ramsey considered this, weighing the risks against the necessity of securing Tank's alliance. "No. But we need contingencies. If I don't come back, the recording and documents go to Green. He'll know what to do." Mouse nodded grimly. "Getting real now, ain't it?" "It was always real," Ramsey said. The ghosts of Jenkins, Garcia, and Devon, Willis hanging unspoken between them. "We're just making it visible." The laundry facility occupied the basement level of Coldwater's industrial building, a cavernous space filled with industrial washers and dryers, steam-pressing machines, and long sorting tables. Third shift was understaffed by design. Fewer witnesses, minimal supervision, a controlled environment for business that existed outside the administration's official awareness. Ramsey was escorted down by a guard who seemed unconcerned with his unusual assignment. "Tank requested you," the man said with a knowing smirk. "Good luck with that." The implication was clear. The guard assumed Tank wanted privacy for violence, and he had no intention of interfering. Another thread in Coldwater's web of corruption. The laundry was humid and loud, the rhythm of machines creating a white noise barrier that swallowed conversations. Tank stood by the sorting tables at the far end, two of his crew positioned near the entrance. No guards were visible inside the facility. "Search him," Tank ordered as Ramsey approached. One of Tank's men patted Ramsey down thoroughly, finding the plastic-wrapped documents. He handed them to Tank, who examined the packet without opening it. "You came prepared," he observed. "You'll want privacy for this," Ramsey advised, nodding toward the small office at the back of the facility. Tank studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the office. "Let's talk." Inside the cramped supervisor's office, Tank locked the door and turned to Ramsey. Without warning, his massive hand shot out, gripping Ramsey's throat and lifting him against the wall. "Before I read what's in here," Tank said, his voice deadly calm as Ramsey struggled for air, "you need to understand something. My brother was everything to me. If you're using his death to play some game, I will tear you apart piece by piece. They'll never find enough of you to bury. Understand?" Ramsey managed a nod, spots dancing at the edges of his vision. Tank released him, allowing him to collapse into a chair, gasping. "Read it," Ramsey wheezed when he could speak again. "All of it." Tank opened the packet, spreading the documents across the desk. For several minutes, the only sound was his controlled breathing and the rustle of papers as he methodically read each page. His expression remained neutral, but the tension in his shoulders built with each document. When he finished, he sat perfectly still, staring at Torres's statement describing Devon's final moments. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. "What did my brother know that got him killed?" According to Torres, Devon witnessed a guard selling contraband to inmates, Ramsey explained, rubbing his throat. "Not just drugs, weapons. When Devon threatened to expose it, the guard went to Kincaid. They staged a code red to silence him but miscalculated the force." Tank's massive fist slammed onto the desk, the sudden violence making Ramsey flinch. 2 years, he growled. 2 years I believed he OD'd, blamed him for being weak, blamed myself for not watching him closer. Kincaid counted on that, Ramsey said carefully. He uses grief, guilt, and shame as weapons, turns victims against themselves. Tank turned to stare at Ramsey, his eyes burning with something beyond rage, a cold, focused hatred that promised calculated retribution. "What's your play, Professor? Why bring this to me now?" "I need allies with influence," Ramsey answered, honestly. "I have evidence of systemic abuse, recordings, documents, witness statements. But exposing it requires leverage inside Coldwater that I don't have yet. You want me to move against Kincaid?" "Eventually. For now, I need information. Access and protection. The administration is already suspicious. They're watching me, pressuring potential allies. Tank leaned back, studying Ramsey with new calculation. You got balls, Professor. I'll give you that. He tapped the documents thoughtfully. What exactly do you need? Eyes on Kincaid's movements, access to D-block records, protection for key witnesses. Jackson, Green, an officer named Hale. The skinny white guard, he's in on this? Ramsey nodded. Reluctantly, his conscience is our leverage. Tank considered this, his face unreadable. I'll think about it, he said finally, gathering the documents. These stay with me. Understood. Tank moved to the door, then paused. One thing you should know, Professor. I done favors for Kincaid over the years. Kept certain inmates in line, managed problems. Man's been useful to me. Business arrangement, Ramsey acknowledged. Yeah, business. Tank's eyes hardened. But family's different. Blood demands blood. As they exited the office, a commotion near the laundry entrance drew their attention. 2 guards were escorting a new inmate into the facility, a lanky young man with frightened eyes. Fresh fish for 3rd shift, one guard announced, shoving the newcomer forward. Show him the ropes. The moment the guards left, Tank's crew surrounded the terrified inmate. Ramsey recognized the ritual, a new arrival being sized up, tested, possibly exploited. Standard prison dynamics. What wasn't standard was Tank's intervention. Back off, he ordered his men, stepping between them and the newcomer. He's on sorting duty. With me. The crew exchanged surprised glances but complied immediately. Tank turned to Ramsey with a meaningful look. We're done here. Professor, for now. The message was clear. Tank was rethinking his alliances. The 1st shift had begun. Back in his cell, Ramsey found Mouse waiting anxiously. Man, I thought you weren't coming back, he exclaimed with evident relief. What happened? Tank's considering my proposal, Ramsey replied, keeping his voice low. He has the documents. And you're still breathing? That's a good sign. Conditional progress, Ramsey agreed. But Hale was right, it was a setup, just not the kind we expected. No guards inside, minimal witnesses. If Tank had decided I was lying, you'd be in pieces in a laundry bag, Mouse finished grimly. So what now? Now we watch. Tank needs time to process what he's learned, decide how to act on it. Ramsey settled onto his bunk, wincing as his still-healing ribs protested. Meanwhile, there's the matter of Kincaid's suspicions. Hale's been compromised. Mouse nodded. About that. While you were in laundry, I had a little chat with our friend Jackson. Man's been busy since his transfer, mapped out every guard rotation, identified every camera blind spot. Says there's a filing cabinet in administration that nobody touches except Warden Mullins and Kincaid. Personnel records, incident reports. Better. Grievance forms, hundreds of them going back years, all marked resolved, no action required. Ramsey sat up straighter, ignoring the pain. How does he know this? Worked as a janitor in administration for 6 months. Saw Kincaid adding to the cabinet weekly. Always the same procedure. Grievance form goes in, denial letter comes out. Nothing gets entered in the computer system. We need access to that cabinet. Mouse grinned. Already working on it. Jackson says there's a ventilation duct that runs directly over administration. Maintenance access from the roof. Ramsey shook his head, impressed despite himself. You've been busy. Figure we all got skills, Mouse replied with a shrug. You do the thinking, I do the connecting. Speaking of which, heard something interesting about your boy Hale. What? Man's got a past with Coldwater. His uncle was a guard here. Died during a riot 12 years back. Same riot that killed Kincaid's daddy. Ramsey absorbed this new information, the implications shifting his understanding of Hale's position. That explains the conflicted loyalty, family legacy versus moral compass. Yeah, and maybe why Kincaid took special interest in breaking him in. A sudden silence fell over the cell block, the distinctive quiet that indicated approaching authority. Moments later, Kincaid appeared at their cell, his cold eyes scanning their sparse living space. Well, well, the professor returns from laundry all in one piece. His tone was conversational, but his gaze was calculating. Interesting, given Tank's usual hospitality toward intellectual types. We found common ground, Ramsey replied evenly. I'm sure you did. Kincaid leaned against the bars, his posture deceptively casual. You're making quite the impression for a new arrival, Ramsey. Connections in the library, special assignments in laundry, conversations with my officers. Just trying to adjust to my new environment. Adjustment means accepting your place, Kincaid countered, his voice hardening slightly. Some inmates never learn that lesson. They keep pushing, testing boundaries, asking questions that don't concern them. Sounds like you've dealt with the type before. More than I can count. Kincaid's smile never reached his eyes. Not one of them lasted. Think about that, Professor. 15 years is a long time to spend looking over your shoulder. With that warning delivered, he moved on, continuing his rounds with unhurried confidence. Mouse waited until Kincaid was well out of earshot before whispering, "Man's definitely onto something." "Good," Ramsey replied, surprising Mouse with his calm. "Pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes create opportunities. Unless the mistake is you ending up like Devin Willis." Ramsey nodded, acknowledging the risk. "That's why we need those grievance forms. Patterns of evidence are harder to erase than individual threats." As lockdown settled over the block for the night, Ramsey lay awake planning their next move. Tank's alliance was tentative but promising. Hale's position was increasingly precarious. And somewhere in administration, a filing cabinet full of systemic abuses waited to be exposed. The game was accelerating now, pieces moving more rapidly across the board. Kincaid was still playing defense, responding to threats rather than anticipating them. But that wouldn't last. Once he identified the true scope of Ramsey's operation, he would move decisively to eliminate the threat. They needed to be ready when he did. The state investigation stalled almost immediately. 3 days after the confrontation in the library, the Joint Legislative Committee departed Coldwater with promises of thorough review and appropriate action. Warden Mullins held a press conference announcing Kincaid's suspension pending internal investigation, her carefully worded statement, positioning herself as the vigilant administrator who uncovered concerning irregularities. Most telling of all, the ledger was nowhere to be found. "They switched it," Mouse explained, his voice low as he paced their cell. Ramsey had been returned to general population, no explanation given for his time in segregation. During the chaos in the library, when the state police took Kincaid away, that guard Richards grabbed what he thought was the ledger. But it was just a maintenance log Green had ready. And the real ledger? Tank's crew has it hidden, but it's not enough on its own. Kincaid was smart, used codes, abbreviations, no full names. We need the key to unlock it, prove what each entry means. Ramsey absorbed this setback with outward calm. So Kincaid's suspended but protected. Mullins is rewriting the narrative, and we still lack definitive proof. Worse, Mouse added grimly. Word from administration is they're planning a mass transfer. 20 inmates identified as agitators, including you, me, Jackson, and Green, splitting us up, sending us to different facilities across the state. When? 3 days. They're calling it a security redistribution after the unfounded disruption. Ramsey nodded thoughtfully. The system was closing ranks, eliminating threats through bureaucratic means rather than direct confrontation, exactly as he'd predicted. Then we have 3 days to find definitive proof, he said, starting with that ledger. Officer Hale visited their cell that night during his rounds, his manner professional but his eyes conveying urgency. 2 minutes, he muttered, pretending to inspect their space. I've been reassigned to minimum security starting tomorrow. They're isolating everyone connected to Kincaid. Is he still in the facility? Ramsey asked. Administrative leave. Still has his office, his files. They're giving him time to organize his affairs before the official investigation. Hale's disgust was evident. It's a whitewash. Mullins is protecting him to protect herself. There's a key to the ledger, Ramsey said. Something that explains his coding system. Without it, the entries are just dates and initials. Hale nodded. I heard talk about a decoding file. Kincaid mentioned it once when he was training me. Said good record-keeping requires discretion and distribution. Two separate systems that only make sense together. So he kept the explanation separate from the ledger itself, Ramsey mused. Smart. Where would he keep something that sensitive? His office is under guard, his locker's been cleaned out. Whatever it is, he'll have it close now that he's under scrutiny. Mouse, who had been watching the corridor, hissed a warning. Hale immediately resumed his professional demeanor, making a note on his clipboard before moving to the next cell. But his final whispered words lingered. The infirmary. He has access through the senior staff entrance. If it's anywhere, it's there. The pieces fell into place with urgent precision. Through Green's library connections, they discovered that Kincaid had established a private file room adjacent to the infirmary years ago, ostensibly for sensitive medical records, but accessed only by him and select medical staff. It's in the old wing, Green explained during yard time the next day, his aged voice steady despite the risk of being seen talking to Ramsey. Used to be the psychiatric evaluation unit before budget cuts. Now it's storage mostly. But that room 23, it's always locked. 2 keys only. Head medical officer Chen and Kincaid. Chen's the one who falsifies injury reports, Mouse added. Man's been on Kincaid's payroll for years. Drinks too much, talks too much. Ramsey considered their options, time ticking away with merciless consistency. We need a coordinated operation. 3 points of access. The infirmary itself, the security, monitoring system, and Chen's key. The transfers start tomorrow, Green reminded him grimly. They're moving you, Tank and Jackson, in the first wave, separating the leadership. Then we move tonight, Ramsey decided, during third shift change. Tell Tank we need his people ready. The plan crystallized with dangerous simplicity. Ramsey would fake a medical emergency severe enough to warrant infirmary admission. Hale, working his final shift on their block, would ensure he was the responding officer. Tank's influence would secure access to the security office through a compromised guard, temporarily disabling the camera feeds. And Mouse, with his ability to move unnoticed, would obtain Chen's key through methods best left unspecified. Every element required precise timing, multiple contingencies, and the kind of collective risk that forged unbreakable bonds among the unlikely allies. You understand what you're risking, Ramsey said to Hale as they finalized details through the cell bars. If this fails, it's not just your job, it's criminal charges. Hale's face was set with newfound resolve. I should have intervened the first time I saw a code red. Everything since then has been moral cowardice. And you? Ramsey asked Tank, who had positioned himself as lookout at the tier's end. The massive inmate's expression remained impassive. My brother died in that infirmary while Kincaid watched. This isn't about your crusade, Professor. It's about blood. At exactly 11:43 p.m., as the night shift prepared to relieve evening staff, Ramsey began groaning loudly in his cell, clutching his abdomen and writhing on the floor. Guard! Mouse shouted, his performance convincingly panicked. Something's wrong with Ramsey. He's burning up, can't breathe right. Hale appeared as planned, radio in hand. Medical emergency B304 requesting infirmary transport. As Ramsey was helped to his feet, still doubled over in apparent agony, the first phase completed. Hale escorted him through the quiet corridors, their path carefully chosen to avoid cameras Tank's man hadn't disabled. Chen's on duty, Hale murmured as they approached the infirmary. Tank's man got to him an hour ago. He's had 3 drinks, already getting sloppy. Mouse is in position. The infirmary was dimly lit, a single nurse at the intake desk, barely glancing up as they entered. What's the emergency? She asked, clearly bored with late-night inmate complaints. Severe abdominal pain, possible appendicitis, Hale reported professionally. Dr. Chen requested direct notification for this inmate. The nurse raised an eyebrow but reached for the phone. I'll call him. Already did, Hale countered smoothly. He said to use examination room 3 and he'd be right down. She shrugged, returning to her magazine. Sign the intake and he's your responsibility until Chen arrives. Hale completed the paperwork, then escorted Ramsey down the corridor to examination room 3, strategically selected for its proximity to the old psychiatric wing where room 23 was located. We have maybe 15 minutes before the real. Chen shows up confused, Hale warned as he locked the door behind them. Mouse should be... A soft tap at the window interrupted him. Mouse's face appeared briefly before he slipped inside, producing a key with a triumphant grin. Chen never even felt it leave his pocket, he reported. Man's halfway to unconscious in his office watching basketball highlights. Tanks people? Ramsey asked, dropping his pained posture now that they were secured. In position. Security feeds are looping empty corridor footage for the next 20 minutes. We're ghosts. They moved swiftly, Ramsey's prison-issued slip-on shoes silent, on the linoleum as they navigated the short distance to the old wing. A swipe of Hale's security card granted access to a dusty corridor lined with abandoned offices. Room 23, Mouse whispered, pointing to a door at the corridor's end. Unlike the others, this one had a new lock, its brass gleaming amid the institutional grime. Chen's key slid in smoothly, the lock turning with a soft click that seemed thunderous, in the silent hallway. Inside, they found not a file room but a small office. Desk, chair, filing cabinet, and shelves lined with binders. Every surface immaculately organized, a shrine to Kincaid's methodical nature. We have 10 minutes, Hale warned, standing guard at the door. What are we looking for? Ramsey scanned the room with trained precision. Not a file, something personal. Kincaid keeps the ledger in a custom leather binder. The key will be similarly distinctive. They worked with focused urgency, Mouse taking the filing cabinet while Ramsey examined the desk. The drawers yielded nothing but standard administrative forms and supplies. Nothing in the cabinet but standard medical files, Mouse reported, frustration edging his voice. All properly labeled, nothing coded. Ramsey stood back, surveying the room. We're thinking like investigators. We need to think like Kincaid. His eyes tracked across the shelves, noting the perfect alignment of each binder, the fastidious organization. He's methodical, proud of his system. The key wouldn't be hidden. It would be displayed, but disguised. His gaze settled on a row of identical black binders, each labeled with a year. Unlike the institutional binders elsewhere in the room, these had quality leather spines, gold embossing. Personal items, not prison property. There, Ramsey said, reaching for the binder marked with the year Kincaid had started at Coldwater. His career record, he'd want the key aligned with his legacy. Inside, they found not medical records, but newspaper clippings, commendations, and personnel reports, a carefully curated history of Kincaid's rise through Coldwater's ranks. And tucked between the pages, a small leather-bound notebook with handwritten entries. Dates, codes, names, Mouse whispered, peering over Ramsey's shoulder. LC4, JR2, BT3. Initials and severity ratings, Ramsey realized, scanning the careful script. And here, a legend. He turned to the front page where Kincaid had meticulously created a coding system. LC for lip check, insubordination. JR for jungle rules, racial infractions. BT for behavior training, failure to comply with orders. This is it, Hale confirmed, his face pale as he recognized entries corresponding to incidents he'd witnessed. With this and the ledger, a noise from the corridor silenced him instantly. Footsteps, measured and deliberate, approaching room 23. Someone's coming, Mouse hissed. Not Tank's people, they'd signal. Hale peered through the narrow gap in the doorway. It's Kincaid, he whispered, genuine fear in his voice for the first time. He's alone. Ramsey made an instant calculation. Take this, he said, pressing the notebook into Mouse's hands. Get it to Tank, I'll create a diversion. But, no time. The evidence matters more than any of us. Go. Mouse hesitated, then nodded sharply. Back window leads to the service corridor. Meet at the rendezvous if you can. As Mouse slipped out the narrow window and Hale pressed himself against the wall beside the door, Ramsey took a deep breath and prepared for confrontation. He positioned himself at the desk, calmly opening a random file as the door handle turned. Kincaid's expression shifted from shock to cold fury as he registered Ramsey's presence. "I thought I smelled a rat," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "Faking medical emergencies now, Professor? Desperate times indeed." "Just doing some reading," Ramsey replied evenly, watching Kincaid's eyes scan the room, noting the open filing cabinet, the disturbed shelves. "Fascinating record-keeping system you have." "Where is it?" Kincaid demanded, his composure cracking. "The notebook. I know you found it." "Already gone," Ramsey acknowledged, seeing no benefit in deception. "Along with your ledger. Comprehensive documentation of your reign of terror, Sergeant. Very thorough." Kincaid's hand moved to his belt, where his baton hung ready. "You have no idea what you've done, the people you're threatening. This isn't just about me." "I know exactly what I've done," Ramsey countered. "Exposed a system that profits from brutality, documented the institutional sadism that passes for justice in Coldwater." "You sanctimonious bastard," Kincaid snarled, advancing slowly. "You think this ends with me? The warden, the corporation, the state oversight board, they all know. They all benefit. You're attacking an ecosystem, not a man. Every ecosystem has a keystone predator," Ramsey replied, standing his ground. "Remove it and the system rebalances." "You won't live to see it," Kincaid promised, raising his baton. Tragic medical emergency. Inmate Ramsey suffered a seizure, fell repeatedly. Unfortunate, but these things happen. As he swung the baton toward Ramsey's head, Hale emerged from his hiding place, tackling Kincaid from behind. The two men crashed into the filing cabinet, sending folders flying as they grappled for control. "Run!" Hale shouted to Ramsey as he struggled to restrain Kincaid's larger frame. "Get to tank!" Ramsey hesitated only a moment before racing for the window Mouse had used. Behind him, the sounds of brutal combat filled the small office. Kincaid's enraged shouts, Hale's pained grunts, the crash of furniture. As he squeezed through the narrow opening, Ramsey heard Kincaid's voice rise in triumph. "You're finished, Hale. Aiding an inmate. That's federal time." Hale's response carried through the window as Ramsey dropped to the ground outside. "Worth it to end this. Every damn day." The sickening sound of impact followed, baton meeting flesh with practiced precision. Ramsey knew he couldn't go back, couldn't help. The evidence was what mattered now. He ran through the darkness toward the rendezvous point, alarms beginning to sound behind him as Coldwater awakened to the breach. Ahead, shadowy figures waited, Tank and his crew, Mouse among them, the precious notebook clutched in his hand. "Hale?" Tank asked as Ramsey reached them. "Confronting Kincaid," Ramsey replied grimly. "Buying us time." Tank nodded, no judgment in his expression. "Then we make it count. This way." As they moved through the maintenance tunnels toward their hiding place, Ramsey felt the weight of Hale's sacrifice settle in his chest. They had what they needed now, the ledger and its key, irrefutable evidence of Coldwater's systemic abuses. But the price was climbing higher with each step. Dawn broke over Coldwater with an eerie calm. The facility had been on modified lockdown. Since the infirmary incident, inmates confined to cells except for staggered meal periods, guards doubled at every checkpoint. But beneath the enforced order, currents of tension rippled through every block, rumors spreading, alliances shifting, battle lines being drawn. In the chapel storage room, Ramsey sat with Tank, Mouse, and Green, the ledger and notebook spread before them on a folding table. They had been hidden here for 9 hours, Tank's influence securing them sanctuary through the prison chaplain, a man who had witnessed enough of Coldwater's brutality to risk his position for the chance at justice. "With these cross-referenced, we've got him," Green said, his scholarly precision bringing clarity to Kincaid's coding system. 84 documented code reds in the past 3 years alone, 12 resulting in hospitalization, 3 in permanent disability and Devon's death. Names, dates, injuries, all documented, Mouse added, his nervous energy channeled into organizing the evidence. Plus 20 witness statements we've collected. Tank, who had been silent, finally spoke. What? About Hale? The question hung heavy in the air. Hale had disappeared after his confrontation with Kincaid, removed from duty and confined somewhere outside the main facility. His sacrifice had secured their evidence, but at what cost to him remained unknown. We need to get this to authorities. Mullins doesn't control, Ramsey said, ignoring the question he couldn't answer. State police, FBI, someone beyond Coldwater's influence. Chaplain has a phone, Green suggested. Direct line, not monitored by internal security. Too risky, Tank countered. Kincaid's not sitting idle. Man's hunting us, probably has people watching every communication point. As if summoned by his assessment, the chapel door opened. The chaplain, Father Morris, entered with urgent steps. They're coming, he warned, his normally calm voice tense. Kincaid's mobilized a search team. Official order says there's contraband, hidden in the chapel, but they're armed for more than a routine search. Ramsey made a swift decision. Mouse, take the evidence. Use the ventilation route we mapped to reach the administration wing. There's a fax machine in the night administrator's office. Who do I send it to? Mouse asked, already gathering the documents. Everyone, Ramsey replied. State police, Department of Corrections, local media. The numbers are listed in the administration directory. Send partial documentation to each, enough to establish the pattern without risking everything on one transmission. Mouse nodded, understanding the strategy. No single intercept could stop the full story from emerging. Tank, your people need to clear his path, Ramsey continued. Create a diversion, something that draws attention away from administration. Already planned, Tank confirmed. Got 20 men positioned throughout the blocks. On my signal, coordinated disruptions in the yard, cafeteria, and shop areas. Green checked his watch. Breakfast movement starts in 10 minutes. That's your window, Mouse. What about you two? Mouse asked, securing the documents inside his shirt. We create a secondary target, Ramsey explained. Make Kincaid believe we have the evidence with us. Draw his focus while you complete the transmission. Tank's expression darkened. That's suicide. Kincaid's done playing by rules. He's cornered now, dangerous. Exactly why he'll believe we'd keep the evidence close, Ramsey countered. His psychological profile demands direct confrontation. He needs to win personally, not just systematically. Father Morris checked the corridor. Guards are at the main entrance. 2 minutes, maybe less. Go, Ramsey urged Mouse, who hesitated only briefly before slipping into the ventilation access panel concealed behind a storage cabinet. As Mouse disappeared, Ramsey turned to Tank. Ready to finish what we started? The massive inmate's face showed something rarely seen, grim satisfaction mixed with purpose. Been ready since my brother died in this hellhole. The diversion began with precision as the first breakfast groups were released from their cells. A fight erupted in C Block, followed immediately by a fire alarm in the workshop and a medical emergency in the yard. Guards scrambled to respond, their communications filled with overlapping crises. Amid the chaos, Ramsey and Tank moved through service corridors toward the administrative wing, creating a visible trail that Kincaid's people would surely detect. Their destination: Warden Mullins' office, the symbolic heart of Coldwater's authority. Movement at Checkpoint 3, Green reported through a smuggled radio. He had positioned himself in the library, using its elevated vantage point to track guard deployments. Kincaid's with them. 6 guards, full tactical gear. Right on schedule, Ramsey noted as they reached the administrative sector's maintenance entrance. Is the camera covered? Done, Tank confirmed. My man in maintenance looped the footage 10 minutes ago. We're ghosts on the monitor. They entered the quiet corridor leading to the executive offices, the administrative staff having not yet arrived for the day shift. Halfway to Mullins' office, Green's voice crackled urgently over the radio. Code Black, repeat, Code Black, armed response team deploying to administration. Kincaid's declared an active threat situation. Code Black. Coldwater's Protocol for Imminent Danger to Facility Security. It authorized lethal force, suspended standard restraint protocols, and locked down the entire prison under emergency measures. He's making his move, Ramsey realized. Declaring us armed and dangerous gives him clearance to shoot on sight. Tank's expression hardened. Then we make our stand where it hurts them most. He nodded toward the warden's office at the corridor's end. Let's send a message. They had just reached the office door when the first shouts echoed behind them. Guards entering the administrative wing, radios squawking with tactical communications. Tank forced the lock with brutal efficiency, and they slipped inside, securing the door behind them. "Mouse?" Ramsey asked into the radio as Tank barricaded the entrance with furniture. Static hissed for several agonizing seconds before Mouse's breathless voice responded. "In position. Starting transmission. First package. Sent to State Police Commissioner." "Keep going," Ramsey instructed. "Complete the sequence no matter what you hear." Outside, boots thundered down the corridor, voices barking commands as they approached the warden's office. Inside, Ramsey quickly surveyed their position. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the prison yard, now filled with confused inmates as emergency protocols disrupted the normal routine. The office itself was a monument to corporate aesthetics, expensive desk awards on the walls, framed news articles celebrating Coldwater's innovative management approach. "Perfect," Ramsey muttered, moving to the window where he would be, clearly visible to both advancing guards and inmates in the yard below. "We need witnesses. As many as possible." Tank positioned himself near the door, ready for the inevitable breach. "They'll come in hard. No warning, no negotiation." "I'm counting on it," Ramsey replied. "Kincaid's rage will override his training. He'll want to handle this personally." As if summoned by his assessment, Kincaid's voice boomed through a megaphone from the corridor. "Ramsey, we have you surrounded. The building is secured. There's no way out." Ramsey activated the office intercom, broadcasting his response throughout the administrative wing. "Sergeant Kincaid, just the man I wanted to see. I believe we have a ledger to discuss." "You're holding stolen administrative records," Kincaid replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And you've incited a facility-wide disruption. Surrender now or we will use necessary force." "Necessary force," Ramsey repeated, his voice carrying through the speakers. "Like the necessary force used on Devin Willis, on Jenkins, on Garcia, all documented in your meticulous records." A momentary silence followed, broken by the sound of hurried consultation beyond the door. Then a new voice, Warden Mullins apparently, summoned to the scene. "Mr. Ramsey, this is Warden Mullins. Whatever grievances you have can be addressed through proper channels. This display only harms your case." "Proper channels," Ramsey echoed, allowing contempt to color his tone. "Like the 84 grievance forms documented in Sergeant Kincaid's ledger? All officially denied, despite medical evidence and witness testimony." Another silence, longer this time. In the radio, Mouse's voice came through in a whispered rush. "Second package sent. Local media. They're trying to trace the transmission, but I'm switching locations between sends." Through the barricaded door, they could hear urgent conversation, Mullins and Kincaid arguing in harsh whispers. The power dynamic was shifting, institutional self-preservation battling against Kincaid's personal vendetta. "They're stalling," Tank observed. "Trying to figure out how much we've released, who we've contacted." "Good," Ramsey replied. "The longer they delay, the more evidence reaches the outside." Suddenly, a new voice joined the corridor conference. Familiar, unexpected. Officer Hale somehow present despite his presumed detention. "Warden, this has gone too far," they heard him insist, his voice carrying through the door. "There's documented evidence of systematic prisoner abuse. The state authorities need to be notified." "You're suspended, Hale," Kincaid snapped. "Remove him." "I've already contacted the state attorney general's office," Hale continued, his voice rising as he apparently struggled with restraining officers. "Sent them everything I witnessed. They're dispatching investigators now." A commotion followed. Sounds, of struggle, Hale shouting as he was forcibly removed. Then Kincaid's voice cold with deadly intent. Breach the door. Subdue the inmates. Deadly force authorized. Tank braced himself as the first impact hit the barricaded door, a battering ram or riot shield. Here they come. You ready, Professor? Ramsey moved to the window, ensuring maximum visibility. Just remember, the goal isn't to win the fight, it's to expose the truth. 3 weeks after what the media dubbed the Coldwater Uprising, Malik Ramsey sat alone in a small windowless interview room in the Federal Correctional Institution at Yazoo City. His transfer had come without warning, a 3 a.m. transport with federal marshals, no explanation given, no time to say goodbye to Mouse, Green, or any of the allies who had risked everything. The door opened, admitting a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, her pantsuit and briefcase radiating federal authority. Behind her came a younger man carrying recording equipment. Mr. Ramsey, she began, setting a thick folder on the table. I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Voss. This is Agent Mercer, FBI Civil Rights Division. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. Was I given a choice? Ramsey asked mildly. Voss's expression remained neutral. Technically, yes. Though, I understand the circumstances of your transfer weren't exactly transparent. A recurring theme in Mississippi corrections, Ramsey noted. The ghost of a smile touched Voss's lips. Indeed. She opened her folder, revealing photographs of Coldwater's partially damaged facilities, news clippings, and evidence logs. You've created quite the situation, Mr. Ramsey. 3 federal investigations, a class action lawsuit with over 200 inmate plaintiffs, and a private prison corporation in full damage control mode. Not my goal, Ramsey replied. Just a necessary consequence. Your goal being justice for Devin Willis? She slid forward a photograph of the young man, his resemblance to Tank unmistakable despite his gentler features. Justice for all of them, Ramsey corrected. Devin, Jenkins, Garcia, dozens more whose names never made headlines. Voss studied him with clinical precision. The evidence you compiled is comprehensive. Sergeant Kincaid's ledger alone documents systematic abuse spanning 7 years. Combined with Officer Hale's testimony and the medical records your network obtained, she shook her head slightly. It's unprecedented. What's happening with them? Ramsey asked, the question he'd been denied answers to since his transfer. My associates, are they safe? Voss exchanged a glance with Agent Mercer before responding. Some outcomes I can share. Some remain classified during ongoing investigations. Tell me what you can. Sergeant Kincaid has been indicted on 37 federal counts including civil rights violations and 1 count of criminally negligent homicide in Devin Willis's death. He's being held without bail. A small satisfaction, though Ramsey kept his expression neutral. Warden Mullins? Resigned the day after federal investigators arrived. Currently cooperating with prosecutors, likely in exchange for reduced charges. 6 other officers have been indicted, 4 more granted immunity for testimony. Officer Hale? A softening in Voss's professional demeanor. Reassigned to federal protective custody as a material witness. He's received threats, but he's secure. His testimony before the grand jury was compelling. Ramsey nodded, relieved at least that Hale had survived. And the inmates involved? Tank Willis? Jerome Carter? Willis disappeared during the riot, Voss replied, watching Ramsey's reaction carefully. Official reports list him as unaccounted for, but there are unconfirmed sightings suggesting he may have escaped in the confusion. As for Carter, Mouse, Ramsey corrected automatically. Mr. Carter was transferred to Parchman last week. Standard protective custody protocols. Her tone suggested this was not the full story, but all she could officially share. The implied message was clear. Mouse was vulnerable, isolated in Mississippi's notoriously harsh state penitentiary. A loose end the system might still try to tie off quietly. I need assurances about his safety, Ramsey insisted. We're monitoring the situation, Voss replied, her careful phrasing revealing the limits of federal intervention in state facilities. Now I need to discuss your own circumstances. The moment Ramsey had been waiting for, the price of his resistance. "New charges?" he asked. "Surprisingly, no. Your actions during the uprising were documented by multiple witnesses as nonviolent. Even the administrative breach was conducted without property destruction. You made powerful enemies, Mr. Ramsey, but you were very careful about which laws you actually broke." "I was a professor of ethics," Ramsey reminded her. "I understand systems." "Clearly." She pulled out another document, official letterhead from the State Attorney General's office. "Which brings me to the matter of your original conviction." Ramsey's pulse quickened despite his practiced composure. "What about it?" "The evidence you gathered did more than expose Coldwater's abuses. It revealed a pattern of corrupt practices throughout Mississippi's criminal justice system, including potential evidence tampering in several high-profile cases." "Including mine," Ramsey said, not a question. "The Attorney General has ordered a review of your case files. Preliminary findings suggest significant irregularities in the handling of forensic evidence and witness testimony." Hope, dangerous, painful hope, flickered in Ramsey's chest for the first time in years. He suppressed it ruthlessly. Many men have died waiting for justice through official channels. "This is different," Voss insisted. "Your case has become emblematic of the very corruption you exposed. Political realities alone demand action." "Politics," Ramsey echoed with a bitter smile. "The same force that built Coldwater now dismantling it to save face. If it achieves justice, does the motivation matter?" An echo of his own philosophical questions from his teaching days. "Yes," he answered simply. "But it's a starting point." The interview continued for hours. Detailed questions about Kincaid's methods, Mullen's knowledge, the network Ramsey had built within Coldwater. He answered with precision, omitting only details that might endanger those still vulnerable within the system. As Voss prepared to leave, she paused. "There's one thing I still don't understand, Mr. Ramsey. You could have used your evidence to negotiate your own release, leverage a deal. Instead, you orchestrated a very public exposure that put you at maximum risk." "The system's power relies on silence," Ramsey replied. "Individual deals maintain that silence while giving the illusion of justice. I wasn't interested in an illusion. Even at the cost of your own freedom?" "My freedom was taken long before Coldwater," Ramsey said. "This was about something larger." Voss nodded, something like respect in her expression. "The investigation continues, Mr. Ramsey. Will be in touch." After she left, Ramsey was returned to his cell in the protective custody wing. Unlike Coldwater's oppressive concrete, Yazoo offered a small window, a narrow slit of glass that provided a view of the exercise yard and beyond it the endless Mississippi sky. 2 months later, Ramsey stood in that same cell, watching a television mounted in the corridor as Kincaid was led from a federal courthouse in handcuffs. The news caption told the story. "Former prison guard sentenced to 25 years for civil rights violations, homicide." The camera lingered on Kincaid's face, no longer the confident authority figure of Coldwater, but a diminished man facing the reality of life on the other side of the bars. Yet even in defeat there was no remorse in his expression, only smoldering resentment at a system he still believed had betrayed him, not the other way around. The news shifted to footage of protesters outside the Mississippi Department of Corrections, demands for reform now extending beyond Coldwater to the entire state prison system. Signs bearing Devin Willis's face mingled with others naming victims of institutional violence across multiple facilities. A small envelope slid under his cell door, Daily Mail delivery. Ramsey recognized Green's careful handwriting immediately. The elderly librarian had been released 2 weeks earlier. His sentence commuted after federal investigators discovered evidence that his original drug conviction had involved planted evidence from the same corrupt officer who handled Ramsey's case. Inside was a newspaper clipping and a brief note. "Mouse is safe. Tanks people reached Parchman. The revolution continues beyond walls. Hold fast." The clipping detailed the resignation of 3 judges implicated in the widening corruption investigation. At the bottom, a small article announced the establishment of the Devin Willis Foundation for Criminal Justice Reform, funded by an anonymous donor and headed by a former corrections officer, Nathan Hale. Ramsey folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the pages of a book on his small shelf. Through his window he could see clouds gathering on the horizon, a spring storm approaching, the kind that would wash away winter's remnants and prepare the ground for new growth. His own case remained in administrative limbo. Promises of review moving at the glacial pace of a system reluctant to admit its failures. He might never see freedom. The knowledge sat with him daily, neither crushing nor inconsequential. A fact, like the bars on his window or the scars on his body. But something had changed both within him and beyond him. The evidence he had gathered was now public record, impossible to erase or deny. The networks he had built continued to function, expanding beyond Coldwater to other facilities. And most importantly, the silence had been broken, the essential first step in any meaningful change. A guard appeared at his door, new shift, unfamiliar face. "Ramsey, you have a visitor?" Surprise rippled through him. His approved visitor list remained empty, his isolation nearly complete since the transfer. In the visitation room, separated by reinforced glass and monitored by cameras, sat Officer Nathan Hale. No longer in uniform, his civilian clothes and longer hair transforming him from the uncertain rookie who had first witnessed Jenkins' beating. "Professor?" Hale greeted him through the telephone handset, his voice stronger than Ramsey remembered. "Not for many years now," Ramsey replied, studying the changes in the young man. "You look well. Freedom suits you." "Partial freedom," Hale corrected. "I'm still testifying in 3 separate investigations. Still looking over my shoulder. The price of conscience in a corrupt system." Hale nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. "Worth it, though. Every day I see another indictment, another resignation. It confirms we did the right thing." "The foundation," Ramsey said. "That was unexpected." A smile touched Hale's face. "Tank's idea, actually. Before he disappeared. Said his brother deserved a legacy beyond martyrdom." "He's truly gone?" Hale shrugged. "Officially, yes. Unofficially, there are stories. Organizing in other facilities. Support networks for witnesses against corrupt officers. Nothing I can confirm, of course." "Of course," Ramsey agreed, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "I came because there's news on your case," Hale continued, his expression turning serious. "The federal review found significant evidence of tampering. The judge has agreed to hear arguments for a retrial next month." Ramsey absorbed this calmly, cautious of hope after so many years. "Administrative progress." "It's more than that," Hale insisted. "The prosecutor who handled your original case has been implicated in the corruption investigation. 3 of his other convictions have already been overturned. The political momentum is building for a complete review." "Politics," Ramsey echoed his earlier conversation with Voss. "Always the double-edged sword." "Use whatever works," Hale replied, echoing Ramsey's own pragmatic philosophy. "That's what you taught me." They talked for the remaining allowed minutes. Updates, en masse, on green, on the continuing fallout from the Coldwater exposures. As their time ended, Hale hesitated, clearly struggling with something left unsaid. "Was it worth it?" he finally asked. "Knowing what it cost. What it might still cost? You." Ramsey considered the question with the same careful deliberation he had once given to academic debates in his classroom. "Systems resist change," he said finally. "They're designed to absorb pressure, to sacrifice components while preserving the whole. What happened at Coldwater wasn't a complete victory, just the opening move in a longer game." "That doesn't answer my question." "Yes," Ramsey said simply. "It was worth it. Not because it guaranteed justice, but because it made injustice visible. Once seen, it can never be fully unseen again." As he was escorted back to his cell, Ramsey felt neither triumph nor despair, only a clear-eyed recognition of what had been accomplished and what remained to be done. His body still wore the scars of Kincaid's corrections, his future remained uncertain, and the system that had wrongfully convicted him still stood. But something fundamental had shifted. The ledger had been opened, its contents exposed to light. Men like Devin Willis had names again, histories, justice finally within reach. Men like Kincaid faced consequences for their actions. And men like Hale discovered moral courage they hadn't known they possessed. Through his narrow window, Ramsey watched the approaching storm break over the Mississippi landscape, rain sweeping across the prison yard in cleansing waves. He was still caged, would perhaps always be caged in some form, but the truth had broken free. And in the end, that had been the only victory that truly mattered. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.